The storytelling mind is allergic to uncertainty, randomness, and coincidence. It is addicted to meaning. But what happens if we find our meaning perpetuating the idea that there is no meaning? Harvey Cox stated that all human beings have an innate need to hear and tell stories and to have a story to live by. In Kenneth Slessor's poetry, we can see this model being used with the help of the human experience, so the readers relate and therefore are more likely to act on them. First, Slessor hears an insufficient dominant narrative that results in the recurring theme of despair, present in war, the ever-dwindling clock, and mental entrapment. Then, Slessor demands a new doctrine of individuality and modernism, and with this endeavour he lives his own story. However, sometimes the alternative Slessor promulgates in his poems is pointless, as it is insufficient in replacing the current model due to the absence of a tangible story that one can actually live by. In Beach Burial, there is a clear and important story being challenged and told. As an official war correspondent, Kenneth Slessor witnessed firsthand the true story of war, and contrary to the narrative spewed from his colleagues and overarching collective, he found the war to be a despairful tragedy. Much to the chagrin of the Australian Commonwealth whom he worked, he created the contentious elegiacal poem Beach Burial, which explored the soldier's human experience as perceived by Slessor, through use of storytelling techniques. The foreshadowing paradox of the convoys of dead sailors come with the military connotation of convoys to nail home the narrative that the death of these men is at the hands of the war. Even though these men died for their country, their ultimate sacrifice of ending their story short is barely rewarded, as seen by the quote, "And each cross, the driven stake of tidewood, bears the last signature of men." The imagery in this quote paints a heedless, blunt picture of the collective providing these men not even a headstone for what was propagandized to give them great prestige and honour. The religious illusion of the cross, paired with their pathetic funerals, shows how Slessor, as a modernist, wanted to challenge assumptions surrounding the dominant narrative of sacrificing individuals for the collective, and the false band-aid of God's endorsement attempting to heal the wound of the individuals that perished. In the last stanza, for the first time, Slessor writes using collective perspective. All fought with us or neither, the sand joins them together, enlisted on the other front. This late, subtle identification with the side is anomalous considering his employment at the time, and the paradox of fighting and death further portrays these men suffering from an eternally despairing existence. Adrian Mitchell, author of On the Personal Element in Kenneth Slessor's poetry, praises Beach Burial. In this one poem only, he really confronted the fact of death. Everywhere else is a dramatic projection, and therefore imaginative distancing from it. And having seen it in such vast impersonal numbers, there was really nothing left for Slessor to say. Throughout Beach Burial, Slessor appeals to the audience's fundamental desire for narrative and subsequent empathy that comes with identifying with others' human experiences to promote the audience to rebel against the tyrannical collective and live by a more modernistically focused, individual-based story. Out of Time, an existential poem written during the Great Depression, delves into Slessor's perceived meaninglessness of the human condition. While this successfully hears and tells the story of the pernicious tide of time, it fails to propagate a narrative to live by. This poem is once again set by the ocean. Slessor would have seen boats sail past him day after day at his harbourside residence and felt that life, too, was sailing on by without him. The simile of "I saw time flowing like 100 yachts" as the first and last line of the poem forms a circular narrative which depicts the stampede of time as inescapable in the human experience of both life and death. This poem is also an iambic pentameter, which mimics a heartbeat, indicating that this poem, with all its despair, is, in Slessor's mind, as human as it gets. Unlike Beach Burial, there was no collective to blame. Without a flag whose agony implores birth to be flesh or funeral to be ghost. With nothing to point a finger at, Slessor holds the construct of time responsible instead. He ascribes the motivation of time to be the human experience of agony, which has caused Time's story to be the merciless pursuit of sharing this pain by cutting others' stories short. The enjambment of this quote speaks to the barreling nature of time, which is so powerful not even Slessor, as a storyteller, can contain it. In Slessor's depiction of time, he seems unsure whether this human condition is a comforting or cruel fate, as seen by the quote, "So time, the wave, enfolds me in its bed, or time, the bony knife, it runs me through." This inconsistency, expressed by the juxtaposing metaphors of a nurturing force laying him to rest, and a primitive tool making for a savage death, shows how Slessor saw the capitalized and controlling time as an omnipresent being. Mitchell writes, Slessor's poetry records a continuing confrontation with existential despair. an increasing conviction of the meaninglessness of life and emptiness of language. Two very potent reasons for eventually abandoning the practice of poetry. Slessor's Out of Time demonstrates the danger of a circular narrative that fails to promote a new story for the collective to live by. This failure to abide by the storytelling model leads to Slessor's negative human experience and sends him further into the pit of despair. Slessor seems self-aware in his circular thinking, and tells the story of his human condition of despair in Gulliver, where he contradicts all that he promoted, begging the collective to save him from the story he so adamantly promoted others to live by. In Gulliver, Slessor uses the metaphor of hair to represent his human experience of mental acrimony. Hair over hair, I pick my cables loose. He uses the possessive adjective and first-person perspective of my to further indicate that his captivity is his own fault, which echoes Out of Time, as he couldn't blame this human experience on the collective. With the paradoxical quote, "If you'll do me the honour of a dungeon," which uses the subordinating conjunction of if to indicate that if it was the collective's fault, he would have a story to challenge and provide an alternative to. But because Slessor can't bear to think that the story he lives by might be incorrect and would rather shirk the responsibility to free himself, he instead provokes God. For God's sake, call the hangman. Using religious illusion to say if there was one, he would already be free from his despairing human condition. Brian Appleyard discusses modernism in relation to religion. Modernism may be seen as an attempt to reconstruct the world in the absence of God. But when modernism fails to help Slessor in his story of despair, Slessor betrays all that he has previously vouched for by going against his views to beg God and the collective to save him. Gulliver is another example of the consequences of living by the wrong story. In Slessor's poetry, he demonstrates how critical it is that writers adhere to Cox's storytelling model. In Beach Burial, he hears the untold story of the soldiers, making waves by telling the audience the unbiased truth of the war and the despairing human experience stemming from it, promoting a new story of Australians questioning the collective's authority to cut their individual stories short. However, Slessor struggles when he attempts to provide an answer to life's existential questions. Out of Time and Gulliver both hear and tell a story using this same theme of human condition, but when stories fail to provide a solution to these inherently unsolvable problems, one may even go so far as to contradict everything they have worked for, rather than accepting the responsibility of storytelling.